The 1970s were supposed to give America the ultimate family wagons, big, comfortable, and powerful. Instead, many became slow, ugly, unreliable disasters that still somehow filled every driveway. Some were so bad they're almost unbelievable. And trust me, the last ones on this list will shock you. If you want to see how bad it really got, stay until the end.
The Buick Century wagon is one of those cars that perfectly captures a very specific kind of automotive failure. Not the dramatic, headline-grabbing kind, but the slow, demoralizing kind that wears you down over years of ownership. On paper, it should have been excellent. Buick marketed it as the sensible luxury wagon, something for buyers who had outgrown Chevrolet but didn't want the ostentation or size of an Electra or estate wagon. It promised quiet competence, smoothness, and middle-class prestige. What it delivered instead was a car that never quite did anything well enough to justify its existence. Mechanically, the Century wagon suffered from chronic underachievement. The V6 and small-block V8 engines were tuned almost entirely for smoothness and emissions compliance, which meant throttle response was dull and power delivery felt anesthetized. Even when equipped with a V8, the car never felt quick, only heavy. Acceleration was adequate at best when empty, and genuinely lethargic when loaded with passengers or cargo. The transmissions, especially the automatics from the late 1970s through the mid-1980s, had a reputation for early wear, lazy shifting, and overheating under sustained highway use. Many owners reported slipping, delayed engagement, or outright failure well before what would have been considered acceptable mileage, even by the standards of the era. The suspension was another weak point, not because it was sporty or firm, but because it managed to be both soft and uncomfortable at the same time. Buick tuned the Century wagon to float over imperfections, but without the structural solidity or damping control to make that float feel intentional. The result was a ride that wallowed over bumps, oscillated after highway undulations, and felt strangely unsettled on uneven pavement. At speed, especially on long highway trips, the car never quite settled into a confident stride. Crosswinds pushed it around, expansion joints caused secondary motions, and the rear end could feel vague when loaded with cargo. It wasn't dangerous, but it was never reassuring either. Steering feedback was almost non-existent. Buick leaned heavily into over-assisted power steering, and while that made parking effortless, it also disconnected the driver entirely from the front wheels. On-center feel was mushy, corrections were imprecise, and the wheel often felt like it was moving a suggestion rather than a mechanical system. Combined with soft bushings and rapid suspension wear, the Century wagon could feel tired even when relatively new. Many owners remarked that the car felt loose or worn out long before it actually was, which is a devastating quality for a vehicle sold on comfort and refinement. The interior is where the disappointment became most personal. At first glance, the Century wagon looked upscale. Plush velour or tufted cloth seats, simulated wood trim, chrome accents, and thick carpeting gave the impression of quiet luxury. But time was cruel to these cabins. Seat foam collapsed quickly, leaving sagging cushions and poor support. Headliners drooped embarrassingly within a few years. Plastic trim cracked, warped, or discolored under sun exposure. And the fake wood appliques peeled or faded into something that looked worse than plain plastic ever would have. Switchgear felt cheap and aged badly, with climate controls and radio buttons becoming loose or unreliable. Noise isolation, another supposed Buick strength, was inconsistent. Engine noise was subdued, but road noise crept in through poorly insulated wheel wells. Suspension thumps and rattles became common as bushings deteriorated. Interior squeaks multiplied with age, and once they started, they never really stopped. The wagon felt like it was constantly reminding you that it was built to a cost, not to a standard. Perhaps the most damning criticism comes from owner sentiment over time. Very few people hated their Buick Century wagons with passion. Instead, they tolerated them, complained about them quietly, and replaced them without ceremony. Owners often described them as cars that felt prematurely elderly, vehicles that seemed tired, outdated, and uninspiring even when they were only a few years old. One common refrain was that the car felt like it was designed for someone older than the person who bought it, and then aged faster than that person did. Another frequent comment was that nothing ever felt outright broken, but nothing ever felt right either. This quiet mediocrity is what ultimately doomed the Century wagon. It wasn't unsafe enough to be notorious. It wasn't unreliable enough to be infamous. It simply failed to inspire loyalty or affection. In an era when competitors were improving ride quality, interior durability, and drivetrain longevity, Buick leaned too heavily on its reputation and not enough on execution. Buyers who wanted excitement went elsewhere. Buyers who wanted true comfort and longevity eventually realized Buick wasn't delivering it anymore. In hindsight, the Buick Century wagon represents a turning point, the moment when Buick's traditional strengths began to erode into complacency. It promised refinement, but delivered indifference. It looked comfortable, but aged poorly. It functioned adequately, but never excelled. And that is why it's remembered, if at all, not with anger or nostalgia, but with a kind of resigned disappointment. It wasn't a disaster. It was worse than that. It was forgettable in the most exhausting way possible. A car that slowly convinced its owners that they deserved something better, even if they couldn't quite articulate why.
The 1973 to 1977 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser is a perfect example of how a great name can survive long after the substance behind it is collapsed. In the 1960s, the Vista Cruiser genuinely meant something. It was aspirational, slightly futuristic, and cleverly engineered, a family wagon that felt special rather than utilitarian. By the mid-1970s, that legacy had become a burden instead of an advantage. The name promised refinement, confidence, and effortless American road travel. The car itself delivered frustration, compromise, and a slow erosion of trust. The biggest betrayal came from the drivetrain. Early Vista Cruisers had been known for smooth, torquey V8s that made hauling a full family and luggage feel easy. The 1973 to 1977 versions arrived at the absolute worst possible moment in American automotive history. Emissions regulations, fuel economy panic, and corporate cost-cutting collided all at once. Engines like the Oldsmobile 350 and later downsized V8s were strangled by emissions equipment, low compression ratios, retarded timing, and primitive carburation tuning. On paper, the numbers didn't look catastrophic. In reality, the wagons felt exhausted. Throttle response was dull. Passing required planning, and full loads exposed how little usable torque remained. Owners often describe the sensation as pushing a heavy object through mud, not because the car was broken, but because it was deliberately neutered. The transmissions didn't help. GM automatics of the era prioritized smoothness over durability, and when paired with underpowered engines, they were constantly hunting for the right gear. Heat buildup was common, especially during summer highway driving or towing, and early wear was not unusual. Slip-in shifts, delayed engagement, and vague behavior became accepted quirks rather than exceptions. Many owners learned to drive around the car's limitations, accelerating gently and avoiding situations where performance was demanded, which is a humiliating adaptation for a vehicle once marketed as premium. Then there was the skylight roof, the feature that made the Vista Cruiser famous and ultimately made the 1970s cars infamous. The glass panels above the second and third rows were meant to flood the cabin with light and create an airy, open feel. In practice, they turned the interior into a greenhouse. Summer heat was brutal, especially before modern air conditioning systems became truly effective. Even with the AC running, rear passengers often complained of being cooked from above. Tenting helped slightly, but it never solved the problem. Worse still were the leaks. Seals dried out, shrank, or warped, and water intrusion became almost inevitable with age. Rainstorms turned into stress tests. Owners learned exactly where to place towels, how to clear drains, and which rattles signaled another loose trim piece. Structural rigidity suffered as well. The additional glass and roof cutouts compromised stiffness, leading to squeaks, groans, and body flex over uneven roads. As the cars aged, the noises multiplied. What once felt airy began to feel fragile. The Vista Cruiser no longer glided down highways in dignified silence. It creaked, buzzed, and reminded you constantly that it was held together by compromises. Interior quality declined sharply during these years. Oldsmobile still knew how to design a cabin that looked upscale at first glance. Plush seats, wood grain trim, and a generous sense of space created a strong initial impression. But time was merciless. Seat fabrics faded and wore thin quickly, especially under the skylights. Foam collapsed, leaving sagging cushions with little support. Dashboards cracked, door panels warped, and headliners drooped, sometimes accelerated by the heat from the glass roof. Electrical problems became a constant irritation. Power windows slowed to a crawl, tailgate switches failed, interior lights flickered, and wiring gremlins appeared without warning. None of it was catastrophic, but all of it chipped away at the feeling of quality. The suspension and ride quality told the same story of decline. Earlier Vista Cruisers had balanced comfort and control reasonably well for their time. The mid-1970s versions leaned heavily into softness without the engineering finesse to manage it properly. Springs sagged early, shocks wore out quickly, and bushings deteriorated fast under the wagon's weight. Loaded with passengers and cargo, the car could feel sloppy and imprecise. Braking performance suffered as well. Drums faded, pedal feel was vague, and stopping distances grew alarming when fully loaded. Again, not dangerous by the standards of the day, but deeply unimpressive for a car that still traded on an upscale reputation. Perhaps the most painful aspect of owning a 1973 to 1977 Vista Cruiser was the emotional disconnect. People bought them because of what the name represented: road trips, family memories, a sense of American optimism and comfort. What they got was a car that demanded constant forgiveness. Owners often say they loved how the Vista Cruiser looked in the driveway and hated how it behaved once the honeymoon period ended. The idea of the car remained powerful. The reality was draining. By the time these wagons reached their second or third owners, their reputations were sealed. They weren't cherished classics. They weren't reliable workhorses. They became disposable, run until something expensive failed, then quietly scrapped. The Vista Cruiser name survived in memory, but the 1970s cars actively damaged it. They turned a symbol of upscale family travel into a cautionary tale about what happens when branding outpaces engineering. In retrospect, the 1973 to 1977 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser isn't remembered as a failure because it was shocking or outrageous. It's remembered because it was sad. It showed how quickly a proud legacy could be hollowed out by regulation panic, cost-cutting, and declining standards. People didn't stop loving the Vista Cruiser, they stopped believing in it. And for a car built on trust and aspiration, that was the most damaging failure of all. The Ford LTD2 wagon is one of those cars that perfectly captures a specific moment when American manufacturers had completely lost their sense of proportion, purpose, and self-awareness. It was born out of panic rather than vision, a reaction to regulation and market pressure instead of a thoughtfully designed family vehicle. Ford took what was already a bloated intermediate platform and somehow managed to make it feel even larger, heavier, and more wasteful than it had any right to be. At first glance, the LTD2 wagon looked imposing, almost reassuring in its bulk. Ford clearly believed that size still equaled value, even as fuel prices rose and public sentiment shifted. The sheet metal was thick, the overhangs were enormous, and the car carried itself like a full-size wagon despite technically not being one. But once you lived with it, the illusion collapsed quickly. The curb weight was immense, and every pound made itself known the moment you turned the key. Acceleration was lethargic, even with a V8, and with smaller engines, the car felt borderline exhausted just merging onto highways. Fuel economy was atrocious even by mid-1970s standards. Owners routinely reported single-digit mileage in city driving and highway figures that barely crept into the teens if conditions were perfect. This wasn't performance inefficiency in the muscle car sense. This was waste. The LTD2 wagon consumed fuel simply to exist, to move its own mass and drag its bluff front end through the air. For families already stressed by fuel shortages and rising costs, it felt like being punished for choosing an American car. What made it worse was how poorly the space was used. Despite its massive exterior dimensions, interior packaging was clumsy. The cargo area wasn't as usable as its size suggested, and the third-row seat felt like something added late in development to satisfy a brochure requirement rather than a real design goal. Legroom back there was tight, headroom compromised, and access awkward. Kids tolerated it, adults avoided it. Compared to earlier full-size wagons that felt thoughtfully laid out, the LTD2 came across as lazy. From behind the wheel, the experience was deeply disconnected. Steering was heavily boosted and completely numb, offering no sense of what the front tires were doing. On-center feel was vague, requiring constant correction at highway speeds. In crosswinds, the car wandered, and drivers learned to grip the wheel tightly without ever feeling truly in control. The suspension leaned dramatically in corners, not in a smooth, predictable way, but with a slow, delayed roll that made passengers uneasy. It didn't feel like comfort tuning, it felt like indecision. Braking performance was another weak point. With a full load of passengers and cargo, stopping distances grew uncomfortably long. Pedal feel was soft, and repeated braking could quickly reveal fade. This was especially unsettling because the car's mass demanded strong, confident brakes, yet the system never quite delivered them. Drivers learned to anticipate stops far in advance, reinforcing the feeling that the car was always one step behind events. Around town, the LTD2 wagon was a chore. Parking it was genuinely stressful. The hood stretched endlessly ahead of the driver, sightlines were poor, and the turning circle felt enormous. Maneuvering in tight spaces required patience and planning, and mistakes were common. Owners joked that every trip to the grocery store felt like captaining a ship into a crowded harbor. That might sound charming in hindsight, but at the time it was simply exhausting. Build quality reflected the broader decline of the era. Panels didn't always line up cleanly, interior trim aged quickly, and rattles developed early. Vinyl cracked, door seals hardened, and weather stripping deteriorated faster than expected. Mechanically, the cars weren't catastrophically unreliable, but they demanded constant maintenance. Carburetors drifted out of tune, emissions equipment caused drivability issues, and cooling systems struggled under heavy loads. Nothing failed dramatically, everything wore you down slowly. Perhaps the most damning aspect of the LTD2 wagon was how joyless it felt. Earlier American wagons, even flawed ones, often had a sense of optimism about them. They promised freedom, road trips, and shared family experiences. The LTD2 felt like obligation on wheels. You bought it because you needed space, not because you wanted it. You tolerated it because there weren't many better domestic alternatives. It didn't inspire loyalty or affection. It inspired resignation. Looking back, the LTD2 wagon is remembered less as an individual failure and more as a symbol. It embodied the exact qualities critics associated with American cars during the malaise era: excessive size, poor efficiency, vague driving dynamics, and a total lack of finesse. It wasn't evil or incompetent, it was just profoundly out of touch. For many families, it became the car that made them question whether buying American still made sense. And that quiet erosion of confidence is ultimately what makes the LTD2 wagon such a powerful, uncomfortable reminder of that era.
The Chevrolet Malibu wagon of the 1970s is one of those cars that rarely inspires anger or fascination, and that is precisely why it stands out as a failure. It didn't shock, it didn't offend, and it didn't even try very hard. It simply existed in a state of quiet compromise, a car shaped by fear of regulations, fear of changing tastes, and fear of investing too much effort into anything that might not sell.
In many ways, it represents the most honest expression of the malaise era, not excess or ambition, but surrender. On paper, the Malibu wagon sounded reasonable. It was smaller than the massive full-size wagons of the early 1970s, lighter and theoretically more efficient. Chevrolet marketed it as a sensible family car for a new, more cautious America. In reality, it inherited the worst traits of both eras. It was still heavy enough to feel sluggish, yet no longer substantial enough to feel durable or reassuring. The downsizing stripped away presence without adding agility. The engines told the story immediately. Once lively small-block V8s had been neutered by emissions equipment and conservative tuning. Throttle response was dull, power delivery flat, and acceleration felt strained even when the car was lightly loaded. Merging onto highways required planning and patience, and climbing grades with passengers and cargo felt like asking too much. What made it particularly frustrating was that all this sacrifice brought nothing in return. Fuel economy remained disappointing. Owners often joked that the Malibu wagon managed to be slow and thirsty at the same time, a combination that felt almost insulting. The driving experience did little to redeem it. Steering was over-assisted and vague, offering no meaningful feedback. The front end felt disconnected, as if the wheels were suggestions rather than commands. In corners, the body leaned excessively, and the suspension responded with a slow, wallowing motion that unsettled both driver and passengers. Emergency maneuvers were especially unnerving. Sudden lane changes caused the car to lurch and hesitate, and it never quite settled afterward. This wasn't a car that encouraged quick reactions or confident driving. It encouraged caution, sometimes fear. Braking performance followed the same pattern. Pedal feel was soft, stopping distances long, and fade could appear under repeated use. With a full load, the brakes felt overwhelmed, reinforcing the sense that the car was constantly operating near its limits. Nothing failed outright, but nothing inspired trust either. Drivers learned to leave large gaps, slow early, and avoid sudden inputs. The Malibu wagon taught defensive driving through discomfort rather than design. Inside, the cost-cutting was impossible to ignore. Materials looked acceptable in the showroom, but aged badly. Vinyl cracked, plastic warped, and fabric wore thin far sooner than expected. Seats were especially notorious. Cushions collapsed, frames loosened, and long trips became uncomfortable surprisingly quickly. What should have been a family road trip vehicle often left occupants stiff and irritated after a few hours. Sound insulation was mediocre, allowing wind noise, tire roar, and drain train vibration to seep into the cabin. Fit and finish reflected a factory culture that had lowered its standards. Trim pieces rattled, door panels loosened, and switches felt flimsy. Electrical gremlins were common enough to be expected rather than feared. None of this was dramatic or newsworthy. It simply eroded confidence day by day. Owners rarely told horror stories about catastrophic breakdowns. Instead, they shared long lists of annoyances, the kind that made you sigh every time you got behind the wheel. What truly doomed the Malibu wagon was its lack of identity. It wasn't stylish enough to be aspirational, comfortable enough to be luxurious, efficient enough to be economical, or fun enough to be engaging. It existed in the middle, but not in a balanced way. It was a car defined by what it wasn't. Compared to imports that felt thoughtfully engineered and older American wagons that felt solid and purposeful, the Malibu felt like a placeholder, a product built to fill a lineup slot rather than to satisfy drivers. Owners often described it with a kind of resigned shrug. It did what it had to do most of the time without ever making anyone happy. That emotional flatness is its real legacy. Cars that are terrible in obvious ways are remembered, discussed, even loved ironically. The Malibu wagon was simply endured. It blended into parking lots and memories alike, leaving behind no strong feelings except relief when it was finally replaced. In hindsight, the 1970s Chevrolet Malibu wagon stands as a warning about mediocrity. It shows how a car can fail, not by being disastrously flawed, but by being relentlessly uninspired. It was the kind of vehicle that made an entire generation of buyers open their minds to alternatives, not because they hated it, but because they realized there had to be something better.
The Plymouth Volare wagon is one of those cars that perfectly captures a company losing control of its own processes. On the surface, it looked like exactly what Chrysler needed in the late 1970s. Clean, squared-off styling replaced the excess of earlier years, proportions felt modern, and the wagon body promised practicality for families trying to downsize without giving up space. In brochures and showrooms, the Volare wagon looked like a reset. In reality, it became a slow-motion collapse of confidence, both in the car and in the brand itself. The problems began almost immediately, often before the car even left the dealer lot. One of the most infamous issues was the front suspension. Chrysler introduced a new isolated front suspension design meant to improve ride quality and reduce noise. Instead, it created one of the most notorious quality disasters of the era. Control arms, bushings, and mounting points wore out at alarming rates. Many Volare wagons developed a visible nose-down stance within months, the front end sagging as if the car were permanently exhausted. Owners described steering wheels that sat crooked, headlights that pointed at the pavement, and tires that wore unevenly long before their time. Steering feel was vague when everything was new and became genuinely unsettling as components loosened. The wagon's added weight only magnified the problem. At highway speeds, the car wandered constantly, requiring small corrections just to stay in a lane. Crosswinds made it worse, and long trips became tiring not because of discomfort, but because the driver was always compensating. Many owners said the car never tracked straight, even after multiple alignments, as if the chassis itself were fighting them. Rust was another silent killer, and far more serious than cosmetic bubbling. Volare wagons were notorious for corrosion in structural areas, including frame rails, suspension mounting points, and floors. In some climates, serious rust appeared within just a few years. This wasn't surface neglect. This was metal disappearing where it mattered. Doors sagged not just because hinges were weak, but because the surrounding structure was deteriorating. Wagons suffered more than sedans because the longer roof and rear opening reduced overall rigidity, accelerating fatigue and corrosion. Inside, the sense of disappointment continued. Dashboards cracked under sunlight, sometimes dramatically, splitting across the top in wide, ugly fractures. Door panels warped, trim pieces fell off, and seat frames loosened. Electrical issues were common and unpredictable. Gauges stopped working, warning lights flickered randomly, and accessories failed without pattern. It wasn't uncommon for owners to joke that the car had moods. Some days everything worked, other days nothing did. The driving experience never redeemed these flaws. Engines were adequate at best, strangled by emissions equipment and conservative tuning. Acceleration was dull, and fuel economy rarely matched expectations. Transmissions shifted lazily and sometimes harshly, especially as mileage accumulated. Brakes were serviceable when new, but felt marginal once the car was loaded with passengers and cargo. The Volare wagon never felt confident doing the very thing it was designed for, which was hauling families and their lives. What made the Volare wagon particularly painful was the sense that it was never quite finished. Panel gaps varied wildly, paint quality was inconsistent, and assembly errors were common. Owners often reported that their cars spent more time at the dealership than any vehicle they'd owned before. Repairs fixed one problem, only for another to appear shortly afterward. It created a feeling of distrust. You didn't relax in a Volare. You listened to it, watched it, waited for the next warning sign. Emotionally, the car left a deep scar. Families bought these wagons expecting reliability and longevity, especially those loyal to Chrysler product. Instead, they got a car that eroded faith week by week.
Many owners remember the exact moment they decided they would never buy another Plymouth, not after a breakdown, but after realizing the car never felt solid, never felt sorted, and never felt dependable. The wagon format amplified every weakness. Extra weight stressed the suspension, larger body panels rusted faster, and the increased demands of family use exposed flaws sooner. What might have been tolerable in a lightly used sedan became unacceptable in a daily driven wagon. The Volare wagon didn't just disappoint, it exhausted its owners. In retrospect, the Plymouth Volare wagon stands as a symbol of Chrysler's darkest quality control period. It wasn't a bad idea, and it wasn't ugly or outdated. It failed because it was poorly executed at every level, from engineering decisions to manufacturing discipline. It's remembered not with anger, but with a kind of weary disbelief. A car that looked right, promised the right things, and then quietly betrayed every expectation from the moment it was driven home.
The AMC Gremlin wagon conversions occupy a peculiar, almost tragic niche in automotive history, one that demonstrates the dangerous combination of ambition, poor judgment, and the flexibility of the aftermarket. The original Gremlin was itself a controversial creation. Launched in 1970, AMC sought to produce a compact, quirky, subcompact vehicle aimed at the emerging small car market in the United States. Its purpose was straightforward: offer a fun, economical alternative to the giant gas-guzzling sedans that dominated American roads. However, in pursuit of novelty, AMC designers produced a car that was short, stubby, and frankly mechanically marginal. With a mere 97-inch wheelbase and minimal suspension travel, the car was inherently unstable, prone to body lean, and unforgiving in cornering. While quirky and endearing to some, it was a car that demanded respect behind the wheel. Its chassis was designed for its original dimensions. Any substantial alteration was an invitation for disaster. Yet dealers and aftermarket shops saw opportunity. By the early 1970s, the station wagon was still a cultural staple, a symbol of family utility and practical mobility. Some enterprising individuals tried to combine the compact Gremlin with the functionality of a wagon, imagining a small, nimble vehicle that could carry groceries, luggage, or kids. The results were catastrophic. These conversions involved chopping the roof, extending the rear with sheet metal panels or fiberglass, and adding cargo space where none existed before. Proportions were warped beyond recognition. The stubby rear overhang made the car look grotesque, almost cartoonish, while the front remained unchanged, leaving the car visually and mechanically unbalanced. It was neither aesthetically pleasing nor functional, a lesson in why form and engineering must align. Mechanically, the modifications wreaked havoc. The Gremlin's original rear suspension, already minimal, struggled with the added weight. Drum brakes, designed for the car's stock mass, became underwhelming at best and dangerous at worst. Owners reported frightening oversteer under moderate throttle, especially when the car was loaded. Steering, light in the standard model, became twitchy and unpredictable, and body roll reached alarming levels. Internal structural reinforcements were often inadequate or entirely absent, making the extended roof prone to flex and chatter. Road imperfections, normally a minor nuisance in the stock Gremlin, became pronounced vibrations that rattled panels, cracked trim, and made long drives exhausting. Inside, the cabin modifications introduced their own set of problems. Extended rooflines altered the interior volume, but without thoughtful integration. Headliners sagged, weather seals failed, and ventilation became uneven, leaving rear passengers uncomfortable. The original dash and seating layout were poorly adapted, resulting in awkward legroom and compromised ergonomics. Noise levels skyrocketed. Every bump, rattle, or draft was amplified by the newly extended structure. Owners lamented that the car felt like it was shaking itself apart on normal streets. Even the cargo space, the ostensible reason for the conversion, was shallow, oddly shaped, and limited in practical use.
Fiberglass or patched metal panels flexed under load, and hatch mechanisms were fragile, prone to jamming or misalignment. The Gremlin wagon often offered less utility than a standard full-size wagon, while exposing drivers to higher risk. Safety, unsurprisingly, was almost non-existent. The chopped and extended roof reduced rollover protection, and the rear structure lacked proper reinforcement or crumple zones. Seatbelt installations, if present, were often inadequate for the new configuration. With the car already prone to oversteer and nervous handling, these wagon conversions became genuinely dangerous on highways or in emergency maneuvers. Anecdotal reports from owners suggested that even experienced drivers approached the cars with extreme caution, realizing quickly that they were handling a vehicle fundamentally compromised by its own modifications. The irony was brutal. In attempting to make the Gremlin more practical, the conversions made it less safe, less reliable, and less manageable. From a cultural standpoint, the Gremlin wagon conversion exists as a relic of experimentation gone wrong. It speaks to a time when small-scale modifications could be performed by enthusiastic but under-resourced dealers, when regulations were more forgiving, and when the line between innovation and folly was blurred. Today, these cars are almost entirely extinct. Most were scrapped or reverted to original Gremlin configurations, leaving behind only photographs, anecdotes, and a few surviving examples that serve as cautionary museum pieces. They are remembered less for utility or performance and more as a lesson in hubris. No matter how clever the idea, a car's underlying engineering cannot be ignored. In the end, the AMC Gremlin wagon conversion is both fascinating and absurd. It represents a collision of practicality and impossibility, ambition and neglect. It was a car that promised family utility but delivered instability, noise, and aesthetic confusion. It attempted to marry the compact, economical charm of the Gremlin with the functional ideals of a wagon and failed spectacularly. Its legacy isn't just that it was rare or ugly, it's that it embodies a philosophy that could only exist at a moment when automotive experimentation flirted recklessly with safety, design, and mechanical sanity. The Gremlin wagon is a ghost of an era when what-if experiments could briefly exist on the road, terrifying owners, amusing bystanders, and ultimately disappearing into obscurity, a true artifact of automotive audacity and folly.
The Chevrolet Vega Combat Wagon is one of those cars that exists almost entirely in the realm of automotive cautionary tales. It was designed in the early 1970s, at a time when General Motors was desperate to compete with the rising tide of small, efficient European imports. The Vega program promised innovation, efficiency, and modern style, a compact car that could appeal to a broad market while still embodying American practicality. The Combat Wagon variant was meant to be the ultimate expression of this ambition, a car that could carry groceries, kids, or luggage with a sleek aerodynamic profile inspired by European hatchbacks, and yet maintain the lightweight, economical promise of the base Vega coupe. In marketing materials, it looked perfect, compact yet practical, modern yet stylish, efficient yet capable. Reality, however, proved far crueler than any brochure. The heart of the problem was the aluminum inline-4 engine, which GM touted as an engineering marvel. Aluminum meant lightweight, better fuel efficiency, and the possibility of competitive performance in a compact package. In practice, the engine was a disaster waiting to happen. The aluminum block was thin and prone to warping. Overheating under normal operating conditions was commonplace. Head gaskets failed with alarming frequency, pistons seized, and engine wear accelerated at a pace that made even modest mileage a trial. Oil consumption was extreme, forcing owners to constantly monitor and top off levels just to avoid catastrophic failure. These issues were compounded by the wagon body itself, which flexed and shifted under the weight of cargo. The very practicality that made the Combat desirable, the extra length, the cargo area, and the extended rear overhang, directly aggravated the car's mechanical vulnerabilities.
The lightweight chassis flexed excessively, which stressed engine mounts, suspension components, and body panels. Owners quickly realized that loading the car near its intended capacity was a recipe for rattles, squeaks, and ultimately mechanical damage. Rust was another devastating factor. GM's attempts at corrosion protection were rudimentary, and the Vega's thin steel panels quickly succumbed to environmental exposure. Wheel arches, rocker panels, roof seams, and door sills developed rust in mere months, particularly in climates with snow or salt. For many owners, the car seemed to be literally disintegrating before their eyes. While other cars of the era could withstand decades of minor corrosion, the Vega's combination of light materials, complex seams, and compromised protective coatings meant that even minimal exposure led to rapid deterioration. The wagon body made this worse by adding more surface area and more points of weakness. Interior components followed the same trajectory. Dashboards warped, trim cracked, seats sagged, window regulators jammed, and vinyl coverings peeled prematurely. The aesthetic appeal of the Camback's sleek lines was constantly undermined by rattles, squeaks, and visible decay. Beyond the mechanical and structural failures, the car's overall reliability was catastrophic. Suspension bushings wore quickly under load, steering became vague and inconsistent, and braking distances were dangerously long when the wagon carried passengers or cargo. Engines overheated not just under extreme conditions, but during normal summer driving or in traffic jams. Owners often joked that the car aged in real time, and for many it did. A vehicle that looked modern and futuristic on day one could be a mechanical nightmare within months. GM attempted to intervene with buyback programs, extended warranties, and partial redesigns of the engine and chassis, but these measures came too late. The Vega comeback wagon had already cemented its reputation as unreliable, fragile, and fundamentally compromised. The impact of the Vega wagon extended beyond individual ownership headaches. It became a symbol of the hazards of rushing an ambitious engineering project into mass production. Engineers had attempted to balance lightweight design, aerodynamic styling, fuel efficiency, and cost constraints, but in doing so, every critical compromise, engine reliability, rust protection, structural rigidity, suspension durability, was sacrificed. In effect, it was a car that demanded near-perfect conditions to survive even a few years of ordinary use. The market quickly turned against it, and the wagon variant, which added more weight and mechanical stress, became an early casualty. By the late 1970s, surviving Vega wagons were often purchased by enthusiasts more for curiosity or nostalgia than usability, with the vast majority scrapped long before they could achieve classic car status. In automotive history, the Chevrolet Vega comeback wagon is remembered as a cautionary legend. It embodies the dangers of overpromising and under-engineering, a car that looked innovative and exciting but punished owners relentlessly with overheating engines, aggressive rust, structural flex, and relentless maintenance requirements. Its story is tragic and ironic. A car that promised practicality and modernity instead delivered frustration, disappointment, and financial headache. But it also serves as a testament to ambition, a reminder that the desire to innovate without sufficient testing or engineering rigor can produce vehicles that are remembered not for what they achieved, but for how spectacularly they failed. The Vega comeback wagon remains a potent symbol of what can go wrong when vision outpaces reality, a vehicle that was simultaneously ahead of its time in styling, decades behind in reliability, and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. It is a car that continues to fascinate collectors, historians, and enthusiasts, not because it worked, not because it endured, but because it is a tangible example of ambition, hubris, and the fragile intersection of style, engineering, and expectation. In every respect, mechanical, structural, aesthetic, and practical, it pushed the limits of what a compact American wagon could be, and in doing so, it failed spectacularly. The Chevrolet Vega comeback wagon stands as one of the most striking, cautionary, and thoroughly unforgettable cars in GM's history. The Ford Pinto wagon is an extreme example of how a small car's compromises could become exponentially worse when burdened with family duties and extra weight. The Pinto sedan was already a study in cost-cutting and rushed engineering, a tiny economy car designed to appeal to fuel-conscious buyers in the early 1970s, but built with cheap materials, minimal structural reinforcement, and a fuel tank layout that would later become infamous. Translating that formula into a wagon magnified every flaw. The rear cargo area added weight the suspension was never meant to handle, creating a ride that felt unnervingly unstable even when lightly loaded. Owners frequently reported that the rear sagged under groceries, luggage, or a few children, with the springs and shock absorbers bottoming out harshly over common road imperfections. The engine, a small inline-4 or V6 in some models, struggled to propel the larger, heavier body efficiently. Acceleration was lethargic, passing maneuvers on highways required careful timing, and the car groaned audibly under load. Wind and road noise filled the cabin relentlessly, the cheap door seals offering little protection from the elements, and interior plastics, already brittle, began cracking and peeling within months. Seats sagged, headliners drooped, and small trim pieces rattled constantly, making the vehicle feel fragile and temporary. It was a car that seemed to age visibly with every mile, a constant reminder that cost saving had been prioritized over longevity or comfort. Worse, the Pinto wagon inherited the sedan's catastrophic fuel system design. The rear-mounted fuel tank, placed just behind the rear axle and vulnerable in collisions, remained extremely dangerous, especially in high-speed rear impacts. In a vehicle meant to transport families, the compromise was glaring. The addition of a cargo area made it tempting for owners to pack groceries, luggage, and children into a car whose engineers themselves feared might rupture its fuel tank in a crash. This fundamental design flaw became the center of national controversy, lawsuits, and regulatory scrutiny in later years, cementing the Pinto's reputation as a cautionary tale in automotive history. Structurally, the car offered minimal protection in collisions. The body panels were thin, crumple zones were inadequate, and the suspension geometry offered little stability during sudden maneuvers. Steering was vague, brakes were marginal, and the combination of lightweight and tall, narrow profile meant crosswinds and evasive maneuvers were unnerving. Unlike European compacts of the era, which often used sophisticated suspension or reinforced frames, the Pinto wagon relied almost entirely on cost-conscious, minimal engineering solutions. The result was a vehicle that felt not just cheap, but unsafe, one that demanded constant vigilance from its driver. Inside, the interior reflected the same compromises. Vinyl seats offered little support, headrests were often optional, and controls were basic and poorly executed. Heating and ventilation were marginal, and electrical gremlins, dim lights, failing switches, and rattling panels were common. Even simple tasks like closing a door or using the rear hatch became reminders of the car's fragility. Families quickly realized that beyond its cute, compact styling, the Pinto wagon was a car that could not be trusted to perform reliably under real-world conditions. Culturally, the Pinto wagon symbolizes the low point of 1970s Detroit thinking, a time when cost-cutting, rushed design, and market urgency overrode common sense, safety, and engineering integrity. Owners remember it vividly, not with fondness, but with a mix of disbelief and regret. Doors felt flimsy, steering was imprecise, the ride was rough, and the ever-present fuel tank risk made every rear-end collision a source of anxiety. While nostalgia softens some 1970s cars, the Pinto wagon remains a stark reminder of how far the industry was willing to compromise, even when families were literally relying on the vehicle for safety and utility. The Pinto wagon wasn't catastrophic in the sense of a one-off disaster. It was a slow, relentless exposure of all the weaknesses of a cheap, rushed car design under the pressures of practical use. It existed, survived long enough to spark outrage, and then quietly disappeared from production, leaving behind a legacy of fear, caution, and incredulity. It remains one of the most infamous family wagons in automotive history, not because of styling or ambition, but because it perfectly embodied the hazards of cutting corners, literal and figurative, in the name of economy.